Tonight, the Ukraine showdown. Russia watchers call for crippling sanctions against Russia, now to prevent a potential Ukrainian invasion.
Because the financial ripples that would create would be immediately felt in Moscow, and it just might cause him to take a step back.
This is the Olympic Games get underway. Even as activist groups call for a boycott over watching the Winter Olympics in Beijing. And a boost for Biden.
America is back to work.
The January jobs report comes out on top. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. The case for preemptive sanctions against Russia. Good evening and thanks for joining us. In Washington, D.C., I'm Jenna Browder. As the showdown with Russia and Ukraine intensifies, part of the battle is on Capitol Hill. Work is underway on legislation aimed at crippling Russia's economy should the Kremlin invade Ukraine. As CBN national security correspondent Caitlin Burke reports, there are questions as to whether these unprecedented sanctions would go far enough.
If Russia chooses to invade Ukraine, the financial cost would be extremely high. Senate Republicans and Democrats are working together on a sanctions package they believe could deal a devastating blow.
It's to include a variety of elements, massive sanctions against the most significant Russian banks, crippling to their economy, meaningful in terms of consequences to the average Russian and their accounts and pensions.
According to Senator Menendez, these sanctions go beyond any ever levied, although some experts worry they don't go far enough.
And I do think the sanctions that they're discussing are important, but I don't know that by themselves it is sufficient to cause the kind of effect on the Russian economy that is going to be needed if we are to truly make Putin think twice.
Marshall Billingsley, former Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing at the Treasury Department, says U.S. sanctions should go after 4 key Russian exports.
And here I'm talking about timber. I'm talking about machinery parts and tools. We don't buy any of this stuff really from Russia and the U.S., but they do export it around to Europe. I'm talking about metals and other kinds of chemical products like fertilizers and plastics.
According to Billingsley, those 4 sectors account for about 30% of the extra money Russia brings in each year. He believes targeting them would cause a massive inflation spike and potentially jeopardize Putin's power. Billingsley argues rather than waiting to respond to an invasion, the Biden administration needs to act now.
Because the financial ripples that would create would be immediately felt in Moscow, and it might cause him to take a step back and reconsider.
As the U.S. prepares for various scenarios, a growing number of Americans wonder why we should be involved at all. Billingsley points to Russia's role as a major energy exporter.
If they invade and then sanctions, even sanctions on banks, would have the effect of disrupting the energy trade, and we will see an immediate spike in gas prices at the pump.
There's also the fact that Ukraine is one of the world's leading exporters of things Americans use on a daily basis, like wheat, potatoes, and tomatoes.
The last thing we need is a scramble around the world to buy potatoes because the Russian potato farms are now or the Ukrainian potato farms are now under Russian occupation, and the farmers have all fled.
Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo emphasized the same point.
Almost a third of the wheat, red winter wheat that travels across the world, comes out of Ukraine and Russia and goes through the Black Sea, the very thing that is being threatened by Vladimir Putin. These things matter to the global food supply. If you're living in the outskirts of Las Vegas or Bakersfield or in Tennessee or Georgia or in the upper Midwest, you depend on these stable food supplies.
Finally, Billingsley points to the U.S. long-standing commitment for democracy.
This discussion about letting the democratic country of Ukraine fall prey to a dictator like Vladimir Putin is not what we as Americans should stand for.
As lawmakers work to finalize their sanctions package, Billingsley warns that unprecedented acts of aggression warrant a truly unprecedented response. Caitlin Burke, CBN News.
All right, thank you, Caitlin. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin has used the backdrop of the Olympic Games in Beijing for a meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping. The summit between the two leaders coming amid growing Chinese support for Moscow as the Russian military continues its aggression in Eastern Europe. President Putin's presence in Beijing makes him the highest profile guest at the Olympics, following a full diplomatic boycott of the U.S., Britain, and other countries. That boycott over human rights abuses in China. Human rights activists calling these Olympic Games the genocide games. Right now, more than 1 million Uyghur Muslims and other minorities are being held in concentration camps in China. Some human rights groups are calling for people to boycott watching the games altogether. And for more, let's bring in Dr. Richard Land, executive editor of the Christian Post and president emeritus of the Southern Evangelical Seminary. Dr. Land, thank you for being with us tonight. In a recent op-ed that you wrote, you called these Olympics a moral barometer for the civilized world. What did you mean by that?
Well, we should never be having the Winter Olympics or the Summer Olympics in China. China is an outlaw nation. It does not belong to the civilized community of nations. And I say in my op-ed that it is the reincarnation of the Third Reich, and that's not a hyperbole. That may be an understatement. They are committing genocide against the Uyghurs. They are doing horrible things to their own people, forced abortions on Uyghur Muslims and others. The police state is so bad that our government has told our athletes to leave their cell phones and their computers at home, not to take them to China, because they would be compromised and sensitive and confidential information would be taken off of them. They are putting together a worldwide gene bank to try to enhance their society genetically. In other words, just exactly what the Nazis were doing with trying to create a master race. This is a barbaric nation. And for the Olympic Committee to roll over and to try to give them a patina of civilization by putting the Olympic Games there is absolutely, it makes me speechless. It is something that has put a stain on the International Olympic Committee that'll be difficult for them to clean off.
Yeah, it's Uyghurs, it's Christians, it's other minorities being held in these concentration camps and persecuted in China. So at last night's opening games, China had a Uyghur Muslim actually co-light the Olympic torch. That's pretty rich coming from President Xi.
Oh, yes. Well, the Chinese, they're very good at propaganda. They're very good at it, much better than the Soviets were. And they are able to play these little kabuki games. But let's face it, the hard, ugly face of China is there. The Chinese communists run that country for the benefit of the Chinese Communist government. And I just in today's Wall Street Journal is an article from a Chinese citizen who has left that country and now lives in Canada, saying that in 2008, before the Summer Olympics, they rounded up any dissident they could find and put them in jail so that no foreigner could hear a Chinese person that would have criticism of the regime. And they've done the same thing for the 2022 Olympics. They've tried to find every dissident that they can even suspect of being a dissident, and they've put them in prison.
Wow. So what can Americans do to stand against China's disregard for human rights?
Well, in regard to the Olympics, I think that what we should do is we shouldn't have boycotted the games. We should have moved them, but we didn't. So now it's unfair to the athletes not to allow them to compete. But I'm taking Laura Ingram's challenge, and I'm not going to watch 1 minute. I'm not going to watch one moment of NBC's broadcast of the Olympics. I'm going to boycott it. I can get the Christian Post is going to cover it, so you can go to the Christian Post or other outlets, and you can see what happened at the games. And I am selectively not giving my patronage to corporations that have been contributing massively to the Chinese government for these games.
Yeah, there are a lot of them here in the United States. What is your prayer for the athletes competing now and for all of those being victimized by the Chinese communist regime?
Well, I think as Christians, we need to pray for all of the athletes of the world. First of all, that they will not be injured as they seek to demonstrate how they've honed the God-given skills that they've been given athletically, and that they will not be arrested or harassed by the Chinese government while they're there. And we need to pray for all of the Chinese who are victimized by their government. If there were a free election in China, all of the Chinese leaders would be gone. They'd be gone completely. The Chinese people are suffering under the dictatorship and the totalitarian boot of the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, and we'll see what happens. There are a lot of fears that after these Olympics, China could be emboldened to, invade Taiwan or make some other provocative move. So we will see. But Dr. Land of the Christian Post, thank you so much for joining us tonight on Faith Nation.
Thank you. God bless.
You too. And coming up, a boost for President Biden. The latest jobs report as inflation continues to soar. Republicans censuring members of their own party over the congressional committee investigating the January 6 riots breaching the Capitol. The Republican National Committee voting to censor Wyoming Congresswoman Liz Cheney and Illinois Congressman Adam Kinzinger for serving on the January 6 Select Committee in the House. The GOP, in a draft resolution obtained by the Washington Post, declaring the January 6th attack on the Capitol, quote, legitimate political discourse. The RNC resolution comes as former Vice President Pence today called out former President Trump in a Florida speech, saying Trump was wrong to say the election could be overturned. Well, a surprisingly strong jobs report out today. U.S. employers adding more jobs than expected, even as Omicron cases spiked across the new year. CBN's Tara Merchner has more.
This jobs report marks the first full impact of the Omicron variant. While economists expected it to be a dud, the numbers are better than expected.
America is back to work.
President Biden praising the latest jobs report this morning. While COVID sidelined more workers than any point in the pandemic in January, the numbers show it was not enough to derail the labor market.
Our country is taking everything that COVID has to throw at us, and we've come back stronger.
Although the unemployment rate ticked slightly higher than expected due to more people joining the workforce, the U.S. added a strong 467,000 jobs last month. That growth coming in leisure and hospitality, professional and business services, retail trade, transportation, and warehousing. On Capitol Hill, Nancy Pelosi praised the news ahead of a House vote on a measure to increase American competitiveness in manufacturing and technology.
We salute President Biden for his great leadership. We salute the private sector for its job creation and working together.
Experts say the report reinforces Fed Chair Jerome Powell's comments that the labor market is strong. This as many businesses find workers hard to come by. The latest figures also come amid the central bank's plan to raise interest rates as early as next month to combat the highest inflation in nearly 40 years. In Washington, I'm Tara Mergener, CBN News.
Thank you, Tara. And joining us now, Joel Griffith, Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Joel, welcome. Happy Friday. So a lot of economists predicting this to be much worse, nowhere near the 467,000 jobs actually added in January. What's your take?
Well, there's a lot of noise in this number. Number one, there's a big seasonal adjustment, meaning the actual jobs, as far as people employed, actually declined by about 2.8 million in January. And that's normal. Usually after the Christmas season, you see the jobs in January shrink, which we actually did see this month. What we do, the Bureau of Labor Statistics adjusts those jobs to account for the fact that people usually get laid off in January. So that number came in at 467,000, adjusting for those seasonal changes. What's really odd about these numbers is this is the biggest seasonal adjustment in January that we have seen in numerous years. So there's a lot of noise in these numbers. The bottom line is that consumers do seem to be shirking off all the threats of COVID that they keep hearing from Dr. Fauci. And where the economy is allowed to reopen, we are seeing businesses continuing to add back in employees and people going back to work. So that is a positive. What I'm concerned about longer term is you continue to see Washington, D.C. try to push in these COVID restrictions. You saw the Biden administration try to force a vaccine mandate. And if you continue to see those types of edicts from D.C., it's going to continue to suppress the recovery that we all want to see.
Yeah, participation also was up. I think that probably also speaks to people more or less ignoring Omicron and saying we're going to get back to work, we're going to go back to life. Amid all the jobs added, the unemployment rate, Joel, rose to 4%. That's up from December. What does that tell you?
Well, that actually says we do see some people returning or entering into the labor force. So that the unemployment rate is based on the number of people that aren't working out of the entire working workforce population, those that are looking for a job or those that already have a job. So we saw about 1.3 million or so people added into the workforce last month at a time when the economy created about 460,000 jobs. So when you have more people entering the workforce than jobs created, you see the unemployment rate tick up. And that's exactly what we saw last month. And if you look at overall the last year and a half, something that's very troubling, we have close to 3 million people that have left the workforce altogether within the working age population in people's 20s, 30s, and 40s. So this is very troubling, and it's becoming very clear Washington, D.C. has been responsible for a lot of those people leaving the workforce altogether.
Yeah, right now there are a record 10.9 job openings in the U.S. Why aren't people taking these jobs?
You're so right. There's over 10 million job openings right now. There's more job openings than people that are unemployed. But what we've seen over this past year and a half, you've seen things like very generous unemployment benefits. It resulted in most people, almost 75% of people that were laid off, found they could make more money on unemployment than working. And you also saw a lot of rolling school shutdowns across the country. In fact, these are still ongoing in places like Michigan and Chicago. Schools that teachers unions refuse to keep the school doors open. So that's made it very difficult for parents. And also these COVID restrictions, a lot of blue cities and blue states are pushing forward on these vaccine requirements. And they're a good part of the population that they don't want to be forced to vaccinate. And that's why you see places like Texas, Georgia, and Florida, you see their jobs recovery much, much stronger than places like Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York City. There's a big difference based on policy. It's very important that governors and mayors keep their economy wide open, get rid of the remaining COVID restrictions, and think long and hard before forcing people to vaccinate as a condition of employment.
All right, Joel Griffith with the Heritage Foundation, thank you. Have a great weekend.
All right, thank you. You too.
And when we come back, why health experts are looking past the pandemic and hoping for an endemic future for living with COVID. Welcome back. Tonight, COVID cases are falling in 49 of 50 states. Still, deaths from COVID in the U.S. are nearing 900,000, nearly twice as many as any other country in the world. New cases per day falling by almost 500,000 nationwide since mid-January. The number of Americans hospitalized for COVID down 15% to around 124,000. The new trend lines giving public health officials confidence to believe the worst of the Omicron variant surge is at an end. And that brings us to the possibility of a new normal. Health experts are looking ahead to a future where COVID could become endemic rather than pandemic, much like the flu. They're also calling for better vaccines to fight the variants. Experts continue to expect the virus to mutate, and some fear the possibility of a 1-2 punch, a variant as deadly as Delta and as contagious as Omicron. Medical reporter Lori Johnson has the story.
Many Americans, weary after 2 years of fighting COVID, are resigning themselves to a future that involves living alongside the disease indefinitely. A new survey shows 75% in the U.S. are tired of the pandemic, and 77% believe most people will eventually get the virus. Still, a third of those surveyed see the pandemic as the country's biggest problem.
But I'm hopeful that we're going to get to a better place in the coming months.
Dr. Stuart Ray of Johns Hopkins put that hope in part on the end of the Omicron surge. The infectious disease specialist is one of many experts who believe it may signal a shift from COVID being a pandemic to an endemic. That means it would become like dealing with the flu, a deadly disease in our midst without major disruptions to daily life.
Tuberculosis and malaria are endemic in some countries and have devastating effects. Millions of people die every year from these endemic diseases. So just because something's endemic doesn't mean it's mild.
Experts point to the need for better vaccines.
It looks like in the coming months, we're going to hear about the results of a Omicron antigen vaccine which will probably be combined with one of the ancestral vaccine antigens. And so that combination may provide better, broader coverage.
Right now, it's nearly impossible to get certain treatments, and that needs to change.
I hope that we'll be able to make those agents more available to people everywhere.
As the coronavirus mutates, it tends to become more contagious, according to Duke Health's Dr. Jonathan Quick, author of The End of Epidemics.
The last 2 years have been stunning. As we've seen this progression of variants.
Often, like with Omicron, more transmissible variants are less deadly, but that's another thing you can't count on.
But what would be really unfortunate if after all of the current viral activity that's going on with Omicron, we had a variant, and there's no reason why we couldn't, that combines both the contagiousness of Omicron and the deadliness of Delta.
So while COVID-19 remains unpredictable, health officials are cautiously optimistic that we'll see this transition to an endemic. While that means future surges could be likely, hopefully major restrictions will be less so. Lori Johnson, CBN News.
Still ahead, a man's best friend on a mission. The ice skating dog that's warming people's hearts and why he took to the ice. Finally tonight, from the shelter to the ice, an 8-year-old rescue dog is sliding right into people's hearts. Benny made his New York City skating debut this week in Central Park to raise funds for the Animal Vision Foundation, wearing his very own custom-made ice skates. The Labrador Retriever was saved on his last day at a kill shelter in Utah. Benny's handler wanted to show how valuable rescue dogs can be, and Benny, as you see, is taking it in stride. The pooch has skated all over the nation to raise funds for charity and help kids with autism. He's also the recipient of the American Kennel Club Exemplary Companion Award for inspiring goodwill in everyone he meets. A job well done, Benny, and to his owner. That's pretty cute, and we will leave it on that note on this Friday evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you right back here on Monday.